So we're going to use watercolour in this tutorial. You can see that I've got a series of brushes, different thicknesses, watercolour palette and a watercolour pad. Now you don't necessarily have to use watercolour paper. The quality of watercolour paper is that it's quite thick. You can use standard cartridge paper, and again cartridge paper comes at different weights as well. So we're going to start off with experimenting with the wet on wet technique. You can see I've sketched out my bee, and what I'm going to do to start off with is start to apply water on certain sections. With the wet on wet technique, what that enables the paint to do is to move around more. So you can create qualities in your painting that are less solid than if you're working on dry paper. So I'm going to start off with this section, and I'm going to start with mixing a light yellow. Start off with the lighter colour to begin with. If I want the colour to be really pale, I add lots of water. I can always add to that as I go along. So you can see that I'm just brushing that through and on sections of my paper, and what I'm getting is a very translucent pale colour. I want to go darker now on sections, so I'm going to choose a slightly darker brown. And I want to sort of create that quality of the, some of the furry quality of the bee. So I'm going to move that brown around and allow it to make quite watery marks. And start off quite lightly, because I can always go darker as it starts to dry. I'm thinking about the kind of marks that I can make with my brush. Now what I could do to start off with doing this is purely make a whole series of marks and experiment with mark making before I even start. It would be good practice to hold on to those experiments and use them as part of my sketchbook work to cover AO2. Okay, so I'm going to take my brush again and start to apply a bit more water, and you can see that that watercolour does start to move. Okay, if I don't put any water onto the surface of the paper, I can apply the watercolour you can see that it doesn't move around as much, but to make sections paler I can add more, just add water. The water sort of moves the pigment, and it enables you to move the pigment. The water's the vehicle, so that is the means of making the colour move. You can see what happens when I'm working on wet paper. You get some interesting watery marks that can be used to describe things like the delicate wings or the sort of water, the furry kind of surfaces on the section of the head. And you can see now I can start adding a little bit more pigment, making it a little bit darker, a bit more intense in parts. So as you can see with watercolour, it enables you to make a range of marks. You can use quite washy marks to start off with, and then working with a bit more pigment on your brush and on a drier surface you can create more linear marks, definite marks to add detail. Obviously if you're working on wet still, then your mark will disperse, wet on wet will disperse into that section, but if you're working on a dry section, it enables you to make more marks like this. What I would probably do from this point is leave it to dry and then get some coloured pencils and work over sections of it to lift out certain points. So obviously I can start to use a more mixed media approach.